Extension Forestry. Whew, all right, now on to the good stuff. We have two speakers this afternoon. First, our local Utahn, Randy Miller, will give a quick overview on the Tree Fund. Randy is the Director of Vegetation Management at PacifiCorp and an ISA board-certified Master Arborist. He is currently the Chairman of the Tree Fund Board of Trustees and also serves on the Board of Directors of ACRT. Previously, Randy served as President of the Utility Arborists Association, sat on several ISA boards and committees, and held leadership roles in both utility and arboricultural organizations. These organizations have recognized Randy's outstanding achievements with numerous awards and distinctions. Randy also has over 70 arboricultural-related writing credits. Following Randy, we have Dr. Richard Hauer. He'll get into the business of emerald ash borer. Dr. Hauer is currently a professor of urban forestry at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Rich has conducted forestry research for over 20 years. Prior to coming to the University of Wisconsin, he coordinated the shade tree program at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. He received a BS in urban forestry from the University of Wisconsin, an MS in tree biology from the University of Illinois, and he got his PhD in urban and community forestry at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Hauer is active with the Wisconsin Arborist Association as their past president and serves as a voting member on the ANSI A300 Standards for Tree Care Operations Committee. He has been active in several committees of the International Society of Arboriculture during the past decade. He has published over 90 popular and peer-reviewed papers and presented over 200 professional talks. Many of us donate to the Tree Fund every year and often don't follow up to see how the investments really pay off. So Randy and Rich are here, and they're going to explain how the Tree Fund operates and how it's really relevant to all of us and provides critical research. So with that, I'll let Randy take it away.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you for allowing the Tree Fund time to discuss some of the good things that we're trying to do to promote tree research and education. Our mission at the Tree Fund is to support scientific discovery and dissemination of new knowledge in the fields of arboriculture and urban forestry. And we do that by providing grants for new research, scholarships for aspiring tree care professionals, and then to support K-12 arboricultural education. We receive no government funding, and so all of our money that we fundraise are from individual and corporate donations, endowment contributions, and earnings. We do our best with our endowment to invest it wisely in order to maximize the earnings that we have, and that's through scholarships and special events. Primarily the Steel Tour de Trees, which is our preeminent fundraising event every year, and then we have a silent auction every year, not just silent, but an in-person auction in association with the International Society of Arboriculture annual conference, which is held the first week of August every year. And then we also have a legacy giving campaign, Heritage Oak Society, and we promote the idea that people that are involved in arboriculture and urban forestry, and people who just love trees, should leave a legacy for themselves by putting aside a portion of their estate with the Tree Fund as a beneficiary. For example, I have named the Tree Fund as a 5% beneficiary of my estate. Last year we had the best year of fundraising we have ever had, raising over $750,000 to devote to tree research and education, to building our endowment, and of course of running a professional organization in the Tree Fund with our staff. Through the years, we've given $2.5 million through 2002, and last year we had the privilege of awarding $309,000. Our research priorities are root and soil management, planting and establishment, plant health care, risk assessment and worker safety, and urban forestry. Last year we collaborated with the International Society of Arboriculture to survey its members on their research priorities, and we were pleased to find that our priorities lined up very, very well with theirs. But the results of that survey will certainly inform the board as we reset our priorities and fund other urban and community forestry research moving forward and providing the scholarships that we do. highlight for last year was a $100,000 grant to Dr. Follini at the University of Florence in Italy, who is trying to look at the long-term effects on different pavement structures, impervious and pervious hardscape, on the woodscape below. It's an exciting study, and one I think that we can benefit from in the long run, as particularly in urban and community forestry, we face challenges of hardscape. And so that's a privilege for us to be able to fund a study like that, particularly with an international flavor. My own preference as the chair of the Tree Fund is that we wind up building our endowment from where it is now at $3 million up to maybe $10 million, so that fellowships like this $100,000 grant that we were able to provide becomes the norm rather than the exception. I was a graduate student at one time, and when you get a $5,000 or a $10,000 grant, as many of our grants are, it doesn't go very far. You have somebody going to school, paying tuition, funding a research study that we expect to be meaningful for $10,000 or even $20,000. It doesn't go very far. And so my vision as the chair of the Tree Fund is to put us on a course where we wind up building our endowment from $3 million, where it is now, up to a point where we reach a critical mass so that we can fund $100,000 studies as a norm, rather than really the grants that we now have as seed money. Undergraduate study scholarships, $2,000, $3,000. It's always inspiring to see and meet these young students and to take a look at their applications and for their scholarships. We get many, many worthy applications, and we wish we could do more. But it does make me proud to be able to provide scholarships for such worthy students and people that want to devote their careers to urban and community forestry, and it makes me feel comfortable about the future. We have other educational grants, as I had mentioned, including Emerald Ash for educational and grants, $10,000. And that's sort of a good segue now into Dr. Hauer's presentation. I would, in closing, like to say that folks that are listening to this have an interest in urban and community forestry. Many of you I see that are have logged in are arborists or city foresters, people who work for extension or state agencies. We owe our livelihoods to professionalism in arboriculture and urban forestry. And what separates us from people who have nothing to offer but a good sales job and the lowest price is research and the education, the time that we put into learning what the research has provided us. So I think that we have an obligation to support urban and community forestry funding, to support the Tree Fund. And so I challenge everybody to make the Tree Fund part of your annual giving. Just $100 a year would go a long way. For example, the International Society of Arboriculture now has 30,000 members. If every one of those members donated $100, that would be $3 million a year that we could use to build our endowment, to fund those $100,000 fellowships that I referred to earlier, to increase the amount of scholarships, the number and the amount that we give, and to run the Tree Fund. So please consider us. Find a Steel Tour to Trees rider, or just go on treefund.org and make a donation, because it's in your self-interest, and it also is something that in the long run will benefit urban and community forestry and the trees and make the world a better place. So with that, Rich.
Hey, thank you so much, Randy. I feel, I guess, old now because I first met you over 20 years ago when you were leaving the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and I was entering as a student. So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So anyways, I'm very pleased to be here today, and I have to thank the Tree Fund first for being wonderful of providing what Randy referred to as some seed money. Wisconsin Arborists helped fund this along with many other great people, including my university. I have to first start off with an old mentor, a friend of mine, Mark Stennis. He taught me a lot of neat things in life, but one that is going to be a primary message today is whether you like it or not, it's going to cost money. And we can apply this in a lot of things in life, but emerald ash borer certainly. Whether you like it or not, this is one of those insect problems that's going to cost communities, homeowners, many others money through the loss of trees. Well, I also want to start with just reading something from Bob Miller when he wrote his textbook in 1988, first edition. He had this statement: using monetary tree value in management decisions making assumes that the community values the street tree population and that it is why an urban forestry program exists in the first place. And basically he goes on to say that whether you like it or not, things such as emerald ash borer, ice storms, windstorms, etc., are things that could perhaps sour a community about trees and give them perhaps a lower negative attitude. And it's you know, from a policy perspective, you take something like this and you have to put it in a context of why do we even care. This statement actually, when we just revised this textbook, the third edition, just came out. Certainly it was as applicable back in 1988 as today. Now, obviously, if trees have no benefits, just getting rid of them would make the most sense. Now, I don't have to educate you on the many benefits from, you know, things that we've quantified from aesthetic or shade tree values, certainly property values. There's literature out there that trees have values from 0 to 40%. Given a certain context, you got to always keep that in mind. Ecologically, we have great tools such as iTree that can certainly, we put a tree population in and get the ecological benefits out. Now, I'm sure many of you have actually used tools like that. We can also look at the economic impact of work of people like Kathy Wolf. I really love a paper and some research of hers where she looked at the business activity. And what she found was if people's perceptions of green areas versus non-green, they prefer green areas, okay? They'd be willing to actually come more often, spend more money, and stay longer at a business that had a thriving greenery outside of the business versus one that's very gray. And so from a business owner, that makes sense. The health impact, it's just overwhelming of the number of papers that have been coming out showing the human health impacts of a vibrant, healthy urban forest, from just physiological and psychological health issues, that spending a period of time, 45 minutes a day, for example, walking amongst the urban forest helps reduce stress levels. So fantastic stuff. Some work from Jeff Donovan. I really love this paper where he actually looked at the impact of emerald ash borer that went into the Ohio area. And actually after a period of time, years of infestation, they looked at the effect of various health issues on people and death. And so things such as lower respiratory tract disease and cardiovascular mortality, what they found out was the time period from emerald ash borer entering an area, a greater and greater effect could be explained from the mortality of people. Now, is this a causation, correlation type of thing? Many people would say, well, the study wasn't set up in that regard. But from the human health aspect, there's actually a few other papers since this time period that have actually come up with a similar conclusion that the urban forest is helpful, and something such as emerald ash borer can have an impact on explaining a higher death rate, people dying sooner rather than later. Now, a few other things, obviously, we have to put in context. How much ash do we have out there? I was looking for statistics for Utah prior to this talk, and I don't know if you guys are really good at Google proofing your information, but I had the dickens of trying to find anything. So I've got the nearest neighbor, Colorado, where getting access to how many ash trees are in communities is a lot easier. Denver Metro, for example, almost 1.5 million ash trees. Boulder, Colorado, for example, almost 100,000 ash trees on public and private lands. Now, one thing I did find, and Salt Lake City has a really neat inventory. Obviously, you're still in the process of finalizing this really neat interactive Esri tool on your website that would, from a management perspective, gives you a great asset of saying where are the ash, how many do you have, what's their size, their condition. These are all things we'll be talking about and discussing today. Now, whether you like it or not, it's going to cost you money, as Mark Stennis would say. He taught me over 20 years ago. Now, there's some model work that Davis Sidner from the Ohio State University developed that you could at least come up with an estimate. Given a state, you could look at the population, and you could come up with a low or high estimate. Now, I'm not going to say Arizona or Colorado, Idaho, et cetera, is the same as the Midwestern states that this work was done on. But at least it gives you a magnitude of appreciation that you're looking at perhaps $9 to $18 billion of potential impact, assuming urban forest in these states is similar to the work that Davis Sidner did. Obviously, getting closer information from home is makes a lot more sense than using a model, but again, it gives us a first approximation. Take Boulder, Colorado, for example. Using his work, it approximated about a $40 to almost $75 million impact. And this is on what he does, it's on a per capita basis, so the number of people in a town or a state, you can get an estimate of the impact of emerald ash borer. Interesting enough, I did a little calculation this morning, and Boulder, Colorado has 98,000 ash trees. If you divide that into the $39 million, it comes up to about a little under $400. In Davis's work on the low estimate, he bases trees at about $400 on the low end, up to about $765 on the high end for his model. So in one regard, Boulder actually fits very well into Davis's work. All right, I want to take a little trip down memory lane. Growing up as a kid, I remember elm-lined streets like this. And I remember going to T-ball, seeing this archway of elms, and just quite picturesque. Early in my career, I started off doing Dutch elm disease inspections and managing actually for an elm population in a community in Minnesota. The latter part of my career, before I came to Stevens Point, I was running a shade tree program that got its start because of Dutch elm disease. So we certainly had great elm populations like this, and in some parts of the world we still do. But overnight, now this could be an ash population, this happens to be an elm. Now this could be the dormant season in St. Paul, Minnesota. It happened to be ash trees prior to coming down that were infected from Dutch elm disease. So whether you like it or not, they're going to die. As a manager, your job is what? To use the biology as a basis to say, is there some way we can somehow perhaps slow or stop the process of this disease? Take Alberta, Canada. They're still actually Dutch elm disease free. How? Well, they're certainly isolated from parts of the world that have had Dutch elm disease. But they've also taken great strides to prevent it from getting to that area. You go to Manitoba and Winnipeg, for example, they've had Dutch elm disease since 1975, and they actually still have a very healthy elm population. Why? Through active control measures I'll talk about here in a second, but also of just investing the money in the urban forest. Now, interesting enough, Winnipeg was on the right end of Dutch elm disease. It was first introduced in this country in 1930. And what they discovered was, in around 1930, was elm trees are dying in the Ohio area. However, it wasn't until about the 1950s and 60s where great volumes of research were occurring. Obviously, we had the Great Depression and World War II that kind of got in the way of some perhaps research on how to slow, using biology, the loss of trees. But by the time the 1970s rolled around, you had people like Dr. Cannon and Worley that demonstrated that if you have very active or best control measures, you can certainly reduce the loss of elms over a period of time. So keep this as a message today with our ash conversation. Well, take Minneapolis, for example. If they would have followed the work of doing nothing, okay, the Cannon-Worley models would say this is what you're going to have for elm trees left after a period of time. And in about 1 to 2 decades, you're going to have very few, if any, elm trees left. Now, if you practice very active control measures, this is what you're predicted to have. Now, how did Minneapolis actually turn out? I've been working with their population of trees for a period of time. I'll show that next. We can call this perhaps the boat of opportunity, a good keel on the boat here. And what did Minneapolis experience? Over their track record from the 1970s, their work has certainly been very active at preventing their elm trees from dying, and actually their actual results, these green bars here, demonstrate that very well. Next, what did they actually not have happen? If you're practicing minimum or no control, in the case of Dutch elm disease, you get these big peaks of cost of money to deal with the tragedy. If you do some sort of active management, you can spread this cost over time. Again, whether you like it or not, it's going to cost you money, or it's going to cost you money at big peaks that become budget busters. Again, what did Minneapolis experience? They had years where they're above, years where they're below, but overall, they're approximating this line of kind of having a spread of money over time that's much more manageable. All right, next, if you look at the Cannon-Worley work, recently working with Ian Hanu and Planet Geo for the city of Milwaukee, we've been looking at their elm populations, asking this critical question. How much effect did stormwater reduction have from their elm population versus how much extra stormwater was going in their sewers as a result of the loss of that urban forest? So as you can see, their actual results, they lost a lot of elms. Why? Because when Dutch elm disease actually arrived in Milwaukee, they didn't have all the science that was getting technology transferred in the 1970s. I'll back up here for a second. Interesting enough, our work with ash, in about a decade, we've come up with mechanisms to solve and reduce the loss of ash trees that took about 40 years of Dutch elm disease. So in one regard, that's a huge success. But again, as you can see, active management to less active to less active to no active management at all, your loss of your population is great. So take a key metric like tree canopy. What did we discover actually with our work here is if you look at actually the actual right-of-way tree population, it was going up until Dutch elm disease started taking over. Then the actual tree population canopy came down. But if we would have been practicing things such as best control practices, the canopy would have been growing over time, providing economic benefits and ecological benefits. So that's another key concept to keep in mind. So now I'm going to get into the work we've been doing with emerald ash borer. Again, I have to thank the Tree Fund, Wisconsin Arborists, several others for their support of this work. And actually, I started working with some undergrads. And we were able to publish our work in the Journal of Economic Entomology. Hats go off to Andy Von Natta and Nate Schupeltz, who are phenomenal students to work with. We did some popular articles here that came out a couple years ago. Well, it all started with my need. I teach an urban forestry class, and I needed a tree inventory. So I set Nate out to measure and identify tree condition rate, all the trees. We've got about 2,000 on campus. And then after they got that done, I said, well, geez, why don't we do a little iTree research project just to demonstrate what the value of our urban forest is on campus. And then I started thinking, what about the ash trees? Okay, what's the effect of emerald ash borer on our campus ash population if we did some practices such as doing nothing? Just let the ash trees die. They're going to die anyway, so why not just let them die? Or maybe actually, what if we took active management in the technologies that we have available for, and there's many out there right now. They're really great treatments that we have. That could be another day for conversation on the efficacy of all these different things. I'll briefly touch on that. Or we could just give up and get rid of all the ash over a period of 5 years. Preemptive removal is one context for that. Or get rid of them, replant them. Or we could also compare it to what do we have if we have actually no emerald ash borer. So when you look at the value of trees, okay, many different ways. You can ask people what's the value of a tree, and they could give you some input. Or we could use a model such as a Council of Tree and Landscape Appraisers. That's a compensatory model where this is the value of a tree that we'd have to be compensated for the loss of it. Or we could use a program such as iTree to come up with what's the functional value, so holding back stormwater or energy conservation, etc. And so those are ways we can value how much an ash tree is worth, for example. Now here's the part, if you're on the west coast, perhaps you're not into your afternoon siesta. If you're on the east coast, this mathematical formula is going to put you over the edge. Actually, it's quite simple. All it says is you can look at trees that are left in the population or that are lost, okay? And you're looking at some sort of value. The value could be from CTLA, it could be from iTree. You could ask people what the value of a tree is. And then for every tree that you have left, you need to subtract what's the actual cost to manage that. So for tree pruning or picking up litter, or what's the cost to treat it? You could think of that as maybe an insurance policy. You could treat a tree, it could still die, okay, but it gives you a greater likelihood of minimizing the loss of a tree. Or there's a cost to remove trees when they do eventually die for whatever reason, or to replant the urban forest. When you put all this stuff, you subtract the costs from the value, and you discount actually for time. Okay, so a common discount rate you could use is maybe 6% interest or 3%. Okay, there's a lot of criterion on what number you'd pick, but you're discounting to bring them into a present time value, and we call this a net present value. You could actually look at that as, in a sense, the profit of a business. And so if you left at the end of the day with a positive number, okay, you're doing well as a business. Same thing with the urban forest. If you have a positive net present value, that means the trees are providing more value than you're spending to actually obtain that value. So, next thing is we spent a great period of time. I kind of jokingly would always tell Andy and Nate that it's only going to take a day, and about 2 weeks later they'd solved the next little research question I had, and this went on for about a half a year. Later on, I actually hired Andy, and that's where the Tree Fund money and Wisconsin Arborists were great because it helped finance his graduate work actually at another university doing some policy work. And so this was his side project he was working on for me to pay his bills. And so we actually took all his work and put it in a spreadsheet program that you can enter data. Now, here's the part that can get perhaps a little overwhelming. It's, oh my goodness, I've got to put information in. I'm going to go through these numbers here in less than 5 minutes to actually give you a sense of what's important and what you need to actually put in to determine what the effect is of different management alternatives. And I'll put this straight up front, that any decision a community makes, I support, because it's their decision. Now, you could look in the context. There's some decisions that are better than others, but we all make decisions, and I would support anything a person would do. Before I get into that, though, what's really important is how ash trees actually die. Now, this part of our modeling is pretty simple to understand. If you remove all your trees in 5 years, preemptive removal, you have none left, okay? That didn't cause me any heartburn to think if I got that part of our modeling wrong. The next part is, what if I get rid of all the trees and replant them? This part's pretty easy for me also to understand, because if I remove a tree or replant it, and I understand natural mortality and planting mortality, I can kind of approximate a model like this. Now, I'll make a little shout out to Randy there. His master's work at UW Stevens Point was actually looking at the effects of planting mortality. So work like Randy did was a key part of work that we do these days. What if we have no emerald ash borer? Okay, this would be what I'd expect for our ash tree populations just from natural mortality and planting mortality, for example. Same thing with treatment. I trust the work of the people like Dan Herms and Dr. McCullough, that the work that they've done looking at the effects of various insecticide treatments, there's many out there, and their efficacy. This is the part when we first built the model, we based this on our best available science, which was actually an abstract, okay? Well, about a year or so after we built that model to approximate ash tree death, I was so happy to see Dan Herm's little graph here that actually our model is pretty similar to theirs. So I was pretty happy to see that. Well, what do you actually see with Dan's work? It's sigmoidal. Like any type of epidemic, it starts building up. It becomes catastrophic. Here's that budget busting time. Many of the ash are gone, over half the population, and your mortality starts declining to the point where you have very few, if any, trees left. This same type of story was also discovered with Dutch elm disease. Okay, this is the work that Cannon and Worley was transferring in the 1970s. So by the time the 1980s rolled around, places like Winnipeg, Minneapolis, Minnesota were able to incorporate this biological way to break the cycle. In the case of Dutch elm disease, it was actually effectively identifying the diseased tree and removing it before insects left with the fungus of that disease. In the case of ash, it'd be wonderful if we had such a technology. We don't have one today where we can go out and look at an ash and say, if I take this one down, I can greatly break the cycle. Okay, maybe someday in the future we'll have that. Right now, I'm unaware of any. We do have chemical treatments that can approximate these type of lines here. Okay, and we do know with ash that if we do nothing, this is what our cost is going to be. So, what do we need to enter? Well, you need to enter as a manager, how many trees do you have? Okay, what's their size? In the case of starting diameter, you can actually maybe guess and pull a Carnac. I'm going to date myself here for a second. Johnny Carson's show where he had Carnac the Magnificent would come out, Ed McMahon, and he would be given some sort of number or phrase, and he would say, such as 17.9 was in the envelope, the starting diameter of the Milwaukee urban forest ash population. Well, in the case of Milwaukee, they had 100% inventory, so this was very easy to quantify. Okay, a lot of different ways to get this number. You could actually sample. Maybe a 2% sample for a town the size of Boulder could give that information. To also get the number of ash trees. So you have to have some sort of sense of what do you have for an ash inventory. Look at Salt Lake City. Now they have a great start. Perhaps they're 100% done now. The other thing is, if you want to look at the effects of preemptive removal, you could do it in a 1-year time period, a 5-year, 10-year period. The whole idea of preemptive removal initially when it came out was, well, ash trees are going to die anyways. Let's spread this cost over time. It makes sense. Okay. The other aspect is trees grow, and so our model actually accounts for a growth rate. This is the actual growth rate of ash trees in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And this is data I've been actually collecting ever since I was an undergrad, going back almost a quarter century ago. And we've been following these trees, and they put on about a ½ an inch of growth a year. Okay, maybe in the Chicago area it's 0.6. I've seen numbers like that. I couldn't tell you what it's like out in the western United States. You'd probably know that information better than I do. The other aspect, and I'll get into these numbers, maintenance cost, removal cost, here in a second. But I do want to point out again that accounting for the mortality of trees from a treatment, okay, this happens to be one I'm told for emamectin benzoate, it has about a 99% success rate, okay, and that's one they recommend perhaps treating every 2 years. So a tree gets treated once every other year. Planting survival, this is numbers from Milwaukee. They expect about 90% of their trees to survive the planting in the establishment time period. And after that, with the ash, this again data I've been tracking for a long period of time, they only have about 8% annual mortality with ash for various reasons. Okay, on to next, these management pieces of information. Now, if you don't have any management information, there's some default values that we had in our models, and it actually comes from the science of Greg McPherson. And we're using, I have just Midwest information in there. He has guidebooks. I accounted for inflation, so his data was from the mid-2000 time period. I adjusted this to actually year 2012 right now. And what he would say was it costs about $3.50 per diameter inch to maintain a tree. That includes leaf litter, pruning, lawsuits from trip and fall claims on the sidewalk. So there's a lot of costs involved. Okay, and so on an annual basis, let's say you prune a tree once every 5 years. That's embedded in here. Our removal cost actually includes stumps, which are about $10 per diameter inch for removing trees. And so in his models, about a little over about $22 in today's dollars is the cost to remove a tree on a diameter inch basis. The other aspect is treatment cost. Now this is one of those numbers where when we first started doing our work back about 3 years ago, you'd get bids of maybe $10 to $14 for a chemical like emamectin benzoate. Imidacloprid was much less than that. And I don't have the exact numbers at the top of my tongue right now. But for this particular chemical, and same thing with imidacloprid, and I imagine triazine is similar, as the markets increase of the number of trees treated, the price comes down. This is actually an in-house value for Milwaukee, that the cost of their labor, chemical, equipment, etc., they can do work for about $3.75 diameter inch, which is low. When you start getting populations of 100 or 200 trees or more, this is some work from Purdue that Cliff Sadoff mentioned to me, that the sweet spot starts occurring where you're getting bids now of maybe the $5 to $6 per diameter inch basis. City of Milwaukee, this is actual data that is from 2014, quantified for some work that we're doing right now. So ideally, you have local data that you put in the model, but if not, you could use the default values. Next, you have to have some sense for the value of trees. Now, this is CTLA system approach, compensatory value. So what you could do here is, in the case of Milwaukee, they replace with 2-inch trees, so that's what we used as a replacement size. This is the average cost, and this is actually from the wholesale market in the Milwaukee area. A tree compatible with green ash, or white ash for that matter, would be about $155 for a 2-inch tree. $200 installation cost is the market value in that area. Here's the CTLA unit tree cost, and species, condition, and location percentages. Now, on a species percentage, some places they say ash have no value or very minimal, and they may put this at 20%. That's fine. If ash have no value, it makes sense to treat. Talking with some tree appraisers, what they would say is, well, if you're actually doing active management, it wouldn't make sense to have a low species percentage. Okay, I'll let that the tree appraisers actually argue that particular matter. In the case of Wisconsin, for example, it's still 70%. Using the work of Ken Simons, the work in Minnesota, they actually still have theirs ranked at this percentage. So condition is actually the actual tree condition coming from the Milwaukee Urban Forest. Again, this is one that you'd have to have your own tree inventory information for. All right, next. This is the part that if you're colorblind, it's not going to help, but if you understand symbols and being shaded in, that will help. And so green is a more desirable outcome, red is a least desirable outcome. Doesn't say this is bad or this is good, okay? You make decisions every day based on resources available. So if you also have a full pie, that's more desirable versus no pie. So here's one outcome, for example, the retained tree analysis, forest net value, okay? So this part right here is something we'll focus on here in a second. And so forest net value, this is that net present value. And so here's the different management alternatives, and this is actually work that we just recently did for Milwaukee. And what can you see here? The case of if you didn't have no emerald ash borer, you have the highest value. You're probably thinking right now, well, I could have told you that without doing a study. On the other hand, these various management alternatives from no control all the way down to treatment, what's your conclusion here? Okay, from a green aspect, highest net value, again, this accounts for the value of trees minus all the management costs. Treatment is actually the most favorable alternative in Milwaukee. We can also look at benefit-cost ratio, so within an alternative. Okay, so the cost of treating a tree, okay, the benefit divided by the cost to do that, you get a number. If it's above 1, that says for every dollar you're investing, in the case of Milwaukee, they're getting nearly $3 back on that ash population. Again, these are trees that are on average about 18 inches and condition of about 70%. And it doesn't surprise me that they have this high of actual benefit cost if they don't have emerald ash borer. And you can see the other numbers. What do they suggest? Actually, other alternatives such as no control is better than preemptive removal, which is actually better than preemptive removal and replanting. Now I've put a little caveat on this. We run the simulation for 20 years. These are trees that are newly planted or have been in the ground for almost 20 years. And what are you going to start getting? Over that 20 to 40 year time period as they grow, this benefit cost ratio should start getting much better. And that's some work from Bob Miller and also Greg McPherson that would actually suggest that. A lot of information here. Here's the part where you can sometimes perhaps get overwhelmed. And let's just focus on a few things. One thing is, manager, what would I want to know? What's the cost to remove trees? Okay, regardless of what alternative, if I do no control, or if I treat, or if I get rid of trees, or if I get rid of and replant, okay, it's going to cost me anywhere from $3 to $14 million approximately to do this type of work. Okay, the next thing is I'd want to think about planting. Is if I don't plant any trees, if I get rid of them all, I'm going to have no cost there. But with the other alternatives, I'm going to have some costs that range from about $2 million to, in the case of Milwaukee, up to $12 million depending on the alternative. Next thing maybe we could focus on is treatment cost. Okay, obviously the only alternative where I'm going to have a cost there is the case of treatment. So in the case of Milwaukee, okay, they save some money by treating where they don't have to plant, they don't have to remove, but they also have to have $18 million available here in one way or another to actually, over a 20-year time period, to manage that ash population. So if we're just focused on costs, and now I have a brother who's a bean counter. He works for a municipality in Minnesota, and this is something he'd have to look at. They've got a budget. And so he could look at the costs and say, well, geez, getting rid of our ash trees make the most sense. It's the lowest cost option. I wouldn't argue that point at all. Okay, or if I focus on treatment, I have this huge treatment cost, but I've got a lower tree planting and a lower removal cost. Or the same thing with these other alternatives. Okay, I've got planting costs and I got removal costs. So if you just look from a budgetary perspective, this is great information. But you can't really stop right there. You also have to look at the value. As I pointed out earlier, if you say trees have no value, we can go back to this slide and say getting rid of them all makes the most sense. Okay, but if trees have values, I'll make an analogy to a house. Okay, we spend monies on painting or putting new siding on, a new roof. Why? Because that's to maintain that investment, keeping water and water infiltration and damage down. Same thing with the urban forest. If I look at the net present value, again, this is an analogy. It would be a business where we have a profit, and so the higher the number, the more net profit I have. In the case here, no EAB is the best alternative. Okay, wish that was the case, but we have emerald ash borer. So if I look at the various alternatives here, what would your conclusion be? Treatment actually gives you the greatest net value. Okay, you've accounted for the cost of treatment, and you've subtracted all the cost to maintain that urban forest. Also, from a benefit cost perspective, we've got that indicator saying that's the best alternative. Now, I've done this work actually for a lot of different locations, and the conclusion that come up with every time is this is the better alternative than this, which is better than this, which is better than this, okay? And so we can look at a couple different treatment options here, midocloprid being one of them. We could look at emamectin benzoate. They've got different efficacy rates, so the percentage survival. Again, these are numbers I've told by the researchers such as Dan Herms. There's different treatment costs, And you could also look at over a 20-year time period, what would be the average mean cost per year for this particular option, or what's the average cost with this particular option. Obviously there's a difference in price, but there's also a difference in survival, as I pointed out. So if I look at this graph here, it kind of points that out, that for example, you have a lower cost here, but you have a greater mortality. So here's the neat thing as a manager. You got to make the decision saying, well, if I want to reduce my costs, I'm buying time where I'm reducing the level of ultimate death, okay, but I'm not getting as much survival as with this option, okay. This is where, from a budget perspective, you have to come up with what makes most sense in your situation. And so let's look at Boulder, Colorado. This is some data I put together for a talk out in Denver a couple years ago. And what do we find there? You know, in the case of Boulder, if there's a 10,000 ash tree public tree population, okay, this is if they favor treatment, this is what they'd have to get their resources. Again, assuming their rates are comparable to the city of Milwaukee, this is what they'd have to have on an average annual basis, or over that 20-year simulated time period. Now, what's really neat is when you do science and you come up with similar conclusions. Deb McCulloch, for example, their plots, what they discover is over time, if you do nothing, you get this big peak pulse of cost of if you don't treat trees versus if you have treating trees once, or 10% of your population versus 20% or 30 or 40 or 50% of your population on an annual basis. What interesting they discovered was, yeah, you're going to have trees that are going to die at a higher rate compared to no treatment versus treatment. What they kind of interesting found out was with these treatment efficacies that if they're only treating 10% of their population annually versus treating 20% versus treating 50% of their population every year, 20% or higher, they actually got similar levels of survivability, okay? The one trade-off is from an urban forest population, you may have some trees that are susceptible and are going to ultimately die. And so if I want to make sure a tree is not going to die, I'd probably want to have it treated on whatever the dosage level and whatever the time period recommendation is for that particular chemistry. But from an urban forest population, I could maybe treat once every 5 years, sacrifice some, but I have a greater overall survivability of the population. So that was kind of a neat science technology that Deb discovered. What does that do to the cost? Obviously, if you're treating fewer trees on an annual basis, your overall cost comes down. Okay, so again, just another option. If you want to guarantee a greater success of survival for any individual ash tree, you'd probably want to treat on, again, whatever the dosage and time period recommendation is for that particular treatment. But from a population basis with emamectin benzoate, for example, you could treat on perhaps a less frequent basis for a population level type of work. Work from Cliff Sadoff. They have a great cost calculator that you can also use that as a manager. Again, you need some inventory information, some decision making on your time span, some treatment cost information, cost data for replacement, removal, and whatever discount rate you want to use. So similar to the work that we did, that you have to have this information. Unless you're Karnak again. The Canadians also, their outcome was very similar to the work of Deb and Cliff and myself, that maintaining your ash population actively with the only option that we have right now, treatment, is better than doing nothing, which is better than getting rid of all your ash. All right, on the home stretch here. This whole deal with emerald ash borer, it doesn't change what we've been doing as urban forest managers for a historical time period. This happens to be an ash tree on our campus population. It was planted as part of the first urban forest. Our campus was first started in 1894. Records say that these trees were planted around the turn of the last century, 1900. Okay, and so in 1900 these green ash trees were planted. They're starting to get brown rot. This is actually where a part of that tree canopy actually snapped off in a moderate windstorm. And so it's at the end of its lifespan where, unfortunately, removal is the best management option for this tree. Putting some sort of protectant in here from emerald ash borer probably was not prudent work, probably investing money on tree removal and replanting just from a safety perspective, especially as you can see in this picture, there's actually sidewalk going right in this direction from this tree. With that goes to our main administration building. I have small trees. They're crummy form. They're in a poor location. Maybe getting rid of this at a younger age makes more sense. Again, as an urban forest manager, you'd be making these decisions regardless of emerald ash borer or not. In the case of a confined planting area, maybe these happen to be trees that are 19 years of age that were about 3 inches in diameter when they actually eventually died. You'd probably say, well, retention of these don't make sense. I'll give you an analogy actually where it does. City Stevens Point, their downtown areas, is predominantly all ash trees. They're stunted because of reduced growth. They happen to be about 12-inch ash trees, but it's the only trees they have right now in that area. So actually perhaps investing some money, retaining some of those while replanting occurs as they naturally would die would make sense from an urban forest manager perspective. Replanting trees in the anticipation of one dying. What I find interesting with this picture, if you're good at tree identification, what do we have here? American elm. What do we have here? Actually, Samaras, it's a green ash tree as a replacement for this ash or this elm tree back here. Kind of a little humor there. If you don't have a nice planting width, perhaps putting a large caliper tree in here doesn't make sense anyways. Maybe using some sort of advantage such as replanting before the death, but using a green easement where this is maybe technically on private property, but you have an easement agreement with the property owner to put a tree in a much better location than in this confined planting area. The other aspect is maybe in areas where you've got construction, it makes more sense of not retaining the trees rather than actually removing the trees because of just the activities that are going to occur. Or in the case of underneath power lines, or in the case where, again, sidewalk construction is occurring, retaining a tree in this situation, maybe removal makes the best option. Well, I appreciate your opportunity for me to speak here today. I'm believing we can open up the chat lines and be happy to answer any questions for as long as you want to for the rest of the day. So I'll turn it back over to our gracious hosts here today.
Great, Rich. Thank you so much. I'm having a little bit of trouble with my speakers here too, so hopefully y'all can hear me fine. If you do have questions for Rich or for Randy, please type them into the chat pod. I did have a question just first off. Rich, does your treatment cost estimates take into consideration any bulk rates or long-term contract deals that some of these companies would be able to get into a contract with the city? Or also with that number, are you seeing the treatment costs going down with the high demand for more ash treatments?
Yeah, from what I've observed and what people have told me that do this work regularly, yes, the prices have come down. In the last 3 years, for example, just the cost of the first chemical that we're using in our modeling went down from about $10 or so per diameter inch. In the case of Milwaukee, they can do it for $3.75. But on the bulk rate contract basis, when you again get a couple hundred trees or greater, I've seen bids in the $4 to $6 range. $4 maybe be on the low end, but I'd say $5 to $6 are certainly very possible. I'll actually mention one thing we did with this work is a sensitivity analysis. I didn't report about that. That's where you tweak one of the variables to see if your decision making changes. In the case of the value of ash trees, we could go down to about 20%, where that's the species condition rating, for example, and you'd say, well, it doesn't matter if you get rid of the trees or you retain them, the decision or the outcome is very similar. Trees have no value. They still have enough value, but you could ratchet down to 20% species coefficient, and you could either retain them or not retain them, and your benefit cost would be very similar. On the cost basis, we could ratchet it up to what I call the Uncle Guido rate of $33 diameter inch, and that's where the breaking point would be, is the cost of treatment is much more expensive than the value of the tree. It doesn't make sense to, it'd be an irrational decision to do that work unless it's a tree in a private setting, for example, that you'd want to retain. So again, on onesies and twosies, the value of the trees are greater than the cost. Okay, you could support actually treatment. But again, on big populations, the cost has greatly come down. That it's a great tool to be able to use for managing urban ash populations over a period of time to buy time.
Great, great, thank you. It looks like we've got a question here from Zach. Did these costs include or subtract the amount a city is going to spend on a healthy forest with no EAB?
Oh, the comparison, I understand your question. The first answer would be no, but I can compare it to a population that would have no emerald ash borer. And one of the slides, if you look at the benefit-cost ratio, if we didn't have EAB in the case of Milwaukee, those trees would be providing about $5.50 of benefit for every dollar invested in that tree population. Okay, and we're actually getting into that analysis where these are trees that have already been planted. We could probably assume that same cohort that from day one of planting throughout their lifespan, in the Milwaukee area, they'd probably be getting about $3.50 per benefit cost ratio. In the case of emerald ash borer coming into Milwaukee, the benefit cost ratio actually went down to right about 3. Okay, it was 2.96 to be exact. So, yeah, we can compare it to having no emerald ash borer in that regard of what the effect of that is. So, great question.
I've got another question here from Alan. Alan asks, can Richard speak to the applicability of his model for individual homeowners or property owners? Can it be scaled down to this level? If not, what methods would he recommend?
Yeah, definitely. Well, my first thing I would say is for individual property, your decision, I would probably focus more on the costs and what's the value to that tree to yourself. If it's something of great historical significance, it's a tree I do not want to lose. Whether the cost of a treatment is greater than the value, we could refer to that as an irrational decision. If the cost of treatment is greater than the value, you want to retain that so you have that ability with the treatment tools we have. On the other hand, if I'm looking at the actual value of that one tree, scaling from 1,000 down to 1, if it's 375 a diameter inch, what I demonstrated with Milwaukee, the results would be the same, whether it's one tree or 1,000. In the case of an individual homeowner, though, it's going to cost you probably 2 to 3 times more to treat that tree because of all the costs that would go along with travel to that particular location. And so in that regard, numbers I'm seeing is maybe 2 to 3 times, again, the value or the cost for the city of Milwaukee, for example.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hauer. I've got another question. I know a lot of the participants on the call today are Westerners who have not yet had to manage or really start thinking about emerald ash borer, and you gave a lot of information about the numbers and how to kind of calculate the cost ratios. Where would you recommend people start when it comes to looking at the numbers? I mean, it sounds like getting an inventory and understanding what's out there is a critical first step. But then, where are there the formulas that you can point them to that you use within your slide that would be the easiest for them to access and really start the ball rolling on their planning?
Yeah, and I can't remember the exact website. On my end, I'm going to just Google it. It's Emerald Ash Borer University, I believe, is what you'd look for. Yeah, and it's emeraldashborer.info/EAB_university. It's a mouthful. What I would just say is Google EAB University. It'll come up the website. A lot of great practical information on emerald ash borer sciences you'd find at that particular website. So hopefully that answered your question. That'd be my first thing if I'm thinking about finding information myself. The next thing I'd think is consult with one of your Department of Agriculture's, your state entomologists, your university personnel such as you have at Utah. You have great people there that certainly understand the science very well. So those are things I'd consider consulting.
Great. Thank you so much. It looks like we've got a few more folks typing in the chat pod. While we're waiting, I did have a question for Randy. As far as the tree fund goes, what are some ways that people can help influence what the tree fund sponsors? If they're interested in particular research, how would they go about tapping into the tree fund?
Meredith, I think that Randy's headset is not working right now, so he can answer your question in the chat box.
All right, we'll wait for Randy. Is there any last comments that you'd like to include?
I could answer that tree fund question.
Oh, great. All right.
I personally, on an annual basis, we have Tour de Trees riders, and I support them 100% financially and just my dedication that they bike 600 miles or so to support research. I can remember going back as a student when people like Ken Ottman were going around rooms at ISA conferences with passing the hats to get nickels and dimes, to the point now people are pedaling for tree research. It's amazing where it's changed from the level of funding 20 years ago to nearly $750,000 a year. And I can echo what Randy said earlier, that the cost of a graduate student, for example, is $30,000 to $40,000 a year. When you look at tuition, stipends, and then actually some money is available for just doing the research at hand. So it can be quite expensive to undertake that. So your support from that aspect is fantastic.
All right, we do have another question from Angela about tree inventory. Can you recommend any specific type of inventory technique that might be good for cities with smaller budgets and or limited time?
Yeah, sampling would probably be the best aspect if you have a limited budget. And then also pick, what do you want to know? That's probably one of the most fundamental questions. If I want to know the size of a tree, I could spend a lot of time with fancy equipment like calipers, or I could use a Biltmore stick, or maybe I'm really good at guessing. I train students where I use different techniques, and maybe you find out with your eyeball, we call it ocular estimate, that I can approximate within 2 inches, and that may be good enough. Or I use a tool called a Biltmore stick that I can quite rapidly to the nearest inch diameter group trees. And maybe you're just looking, is it an ash or not? And you just want to know for this particular thing. From a sampling perspective, towns that are maybe 2,500 trees or smaller, actually the sampling technique is doesn't pay as much dividends. You have to measure so many trees to have a great level of accuracy that measuring every tree makes sense. But when you start getting 10,000 trees or more, sampling does pay dividends, where you could randomly do maybe 10% of your streets, or maybe every other street, or a couple approaches. There are some great guides out there actually for tree inventory sampling out there that the International Society of Arboriculture have published in the Journal of Arboriculture, for example. The other thing is, I wouldn't hesitate to consult again with someone like Meredith. She'd have resources and people that she would certainly know that could direct you in the right situation or location to answer that tree inventory need you have. Well, one last aspect, there's work with volunteers. Now there's some great work that a person, you can train them actually how to identify a tree, how to measure a diameter, and so there's great examples of that maybe being a useful tool in some situations. It works in some situations, but not all.
Great, thank you. And I would just like to add, for those communities in Utah, the State Forester's Office, we have a free app for tree inventory. So especially for small communities, it's a way to use an ArcGIS type of inventory that's free and available to you. And often people will use volunteers or seasonal help as well as their staff to collect the information in that. So there's a lot of creative ideas, and incorporating your state forestry agencies, I think, is a good approach. I just want to read Randy's comments here. The best thing to do is to go to thetreefund.org. That's where you can get all information on the tree fund and see the different grants we have, then dedicate or donate a donation to that particular grant or scholarship. All right, well, I think we've got a lot of things to follow up on and a lot of good information here for those of us, and hopefully we'll be prepared to take on this EAB issue when it crosses the mountains. Thank you so much, Randy Miller and Richard Hauer. We appreciate your time today. If you haven't had a chance, please fill out the polls again, all of you participating. And if you did at the beginning, please also note the evaluation poll here in the upper left-hand corner. We'd like to get any feedback from you about how this all went down. And with that, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.